record a video on the life of Edward Carson. Edward Carson is an important figure in modern Irish history, and knowledge of his life and career be helpful for anybody preparing the pursuit of sovereignty and impact of partition part of their Leaving Cert course. So let's go through really quickly what we know about Carson. So he was a leading Irish unionist. So he's from that side of the Irish political spectrum, which wanted to maintain the close links with Britain that were established following the Act of Union in 1801. And he's famous because of the role he played in and around the 1912 Home Rule crisis. So the 1912 Home Rule crisis was probably the closest, led to a series of events that led Ireland to a civil war, or the closest to a civil war between the Unionist and the Nationalist populations. Carson was right at the heart of those tensions, and that's why he's a significant historical figure. He's always associated with Ulster Unionism, which is somewhat ironic because he's as Dublin as I am. He was born on Harcourt Street in 1854 and into a unionist, Protestant unionist family. He was educated at Trinity College Dublin, which of course was only for people of the Protestant faith at that time. And after graduating from Trinity College, he went to study law and graduated from King's Inns in 1877. So he was a barrister, and he went on to pursue his primary career was as a barrister, and he became a QC, or Queen's Counsel, a senior barrister in London later on in his career. So really successful guy. And before he went to London, he built a reputation as a very effective lawyer. During this period, there was a lot of conflict in Ireland due to what was known as the Land War and the Plan of Campaign. And he was involved working for the government, prosecuting people who were involved in illegal acts of sabotage during that period of agitation for land reform. He was really famous for his involvement in the prosecution of William O'Brien for involvement in what was known as the Mitchelstown Massacre. This was a very controversial case, which was viewed very differently depending on whether you were from the Unionist or the Nationalist perspective. And his prosecution of William O'Brien earned him the respect and the admiration of Unionist population and the enmity and the dislike of Nationalists. So a very divisive figure. In 1892, he was elected to the House of Commons for the first time as a Member of Parliament for Trinity College, Dublin. There were 2 seats in Dublin for Trinity College. And he moved to London because, of course, the Parliament was in London. And he brought his law practice to London as well. And he continued to practice law while in London and serving as a Member of Parliament. And he was involved in loads of really important cases, but his most famous one was the prosecution. It was the case that led to Oscar Wilde being sent to jail for being homosexual. So he represented the Marquess of Queensberry. I'm not going to go into it in too much detail. He represented the Marquess of Queensberry, who was involved in litigation against Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde told lies during his evidence and was subsequently prosecuted and sent to jail. So he really became, Edward Carson, a kind of a household name as a result of his involvement with that case. By the first decade of the 20th century, he wasn't just an important lawyer. He was getting heavily involved in politics. He was involved with the British Conservative Party. That's why in the late years of that first decade, when there was some uncertainty as to who would be the leader of the British Conservative Party, Carson was a candidate. So people were really surprised when he agreed to become the leader of the Ulster Unionist Parliamentary Party in 1910. He wasn't from Ulster. He didn't know a huge amount about Ulster. He'd never lived in Ulster. So it was a surprise that he took that position. But when he took that position, he took it at a really important time in the history of Ireland and the history of Ulster. It was around the time of the constitutional crisis that was sparked by the 1909 People's Budget. And you should know this stuff already. But essentially the People's Budget was an early attempt by the Liberal Party in Britain to bring in a form of social welfare and to bring in tax for very rich people. This was violently opposed by the Conservative Party. Edward Carson was aligned with the Conservative Party, and it led to a crisis in the British constitutional system, which was only resolved with the 1911 Parliament Act. And as you all know, the Parliament Act of 1911 diluted the House of Lords' power of veto. Up until then, they could veto any law as often as they wanted, but that was seen as being undemocratic. There was worries that it could lead to civil disorder and violence, and the power of veto was diluted by the 1911 Parliament Act, which meant that when the Liberal Party and the Home Rule Party, led by John Redmond, made their deal in 1912 to share power, and the Liberal Party agreed to pass a Home Rule Bill for Ireland in 1912, which was the third such bill, it meant that Ireland would have Home Rule by 1914, because the Lords could only veto it twice, once in 1912 and once in 1914. And that meant that the Ulster Unionists were furious, and Carson famously said, "Ulster will fight and Ulster will be right." Now, during that period, he worked closely with James Craig. Just give me 1 second, Scott. He worked closely with James Craig, who was from Ulster and was the leader of the Ulster Unionists in Ulster. And the protest against the potential for Home Rule became more and more intense as the Protestant Unionist population rallied. There were important events. The Craigavon rally of the 23rd of September 1911 was a real show of force. 50,000 people attended that rally against Home Rule. The Balmoral meeting was crucial. On the 9th of April 1912, Carson was right there at the centre of it. That was the meeting which essentially united the Ulster Unionist Party with the British Conservative Party in their opposition to Home Rule, which really gave strength to the Unionist position. And of course, Ulster Day. We all know what Ulster Day was. 28th of September 1912, the huge rallies, the signing of the Solemn League and Covenant by hundreds of thousands of people who were absolutely determined that they would not submit to Home Rule for Ireland. And again, the movement towards civil conflict continued apace, and Carson was right at the heart of it. Carson was not heavily involved. He instigated the Larne gun running. It was his idea. He was a supporter of and a leader of the Ulster Volunteer Force, this illegal paramilitary force which was going to fight to defend Ulster from Home Rule. So as the crisis reached its pitching point, he appeared to be on the radical side of going towards violence. However, by 1914, as the reality of Home Rule approached, he was quoted as saying in April, "Only a fool would fight if there was hope for accommodation." So by 1914, he had toned down his rhetoric. He was less supportive of the idea of violence in opposition to Home Rule. But the fact is that he remained a strident voice against the idea of a parliament in Dublin. His career took a big left turn with the First World War. He became a less important figure in Ireland. World War I, he had a significant role in the British government. He, first of all, offered the UVF to volunteer for the British Army, which was seen as a great act of loyalty and proof of his credentials as a unionist. In the early part of the war, he was the Attorney General, which is the chief lawyer in Britain, which was a very important job in a time of crisis when new laws had to be introduced. He was a member of that coalition government. He actually had a falling out with Herbert Asquith, who was the Prime Minister, and he was instrumental in the replacement of Asquith by David Lloyd George. He was rewarded by David Lloyd George in 1916 when he became Prime Minister with the position of First Lord of the Admiralty, a massively important office at a time when Britain was fighting this war to keep itself supplied in the U-boat war. And he was a failure as the First Lord of the Admiralty, fell out with David Lloyd George and was forced to resign from government. So World War I was a really interesting period of time in Carson's life. We know when it was over what happened. We know that the 1918 election led to a landslide victory for Sinn Féin in Ireland. We know that was seen as a vote for war. We know that the War of Independence happened, and we know that the War of Independence made the idea of Ireland's separation from Britain inevitable. And the way that the British government found to solve the crisis in terms of Northern Ireland was the 1920 Government of Ireland Act, which created the state of Northern Ireland. By that stage, Carson was still the titular head of the Ulster Unionist Party, but he really wasn't very heavily involved. James Craig was the key guy. By 1921, when it was clear the war was coming to an end and the state of Northern Ireland was already in existence, he resigned as leader of the UUP and was replaced by James Craig. And in the last kind of decade of his life, he was notable for his vehement and very vocal attack on the Anglo-Irish Treaty. And then when De Valera came into power in 1932 and began to use the Statute of Westminster to unpick the treaty by, abolishing the oath of allegiance and by undermining the position of Governor General and eventually leading up towards a republic and everything but name, he was a notable voice in London, writing newspaper articles, making speeches against the folly, as far as he was concerned, of letting Ireland go. He died in 1935, still a committed unionist and a man who symbolised British identity in Ireland in this crucial period of our history. I hope you found that useful.